Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. Thank you for joining us this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous supporters of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors, Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. This year, as we recall the 60th anniversary of President Kennedy's historic campaign, and as we look towards the 2020 election, we are so grateful to have this timely opportunity to explore the role of the presidency with our distinguished guests this evening. I'm now delighted to introduce our speakers. John Dickerson is a correspondent for 60 Minutes and author of a new book called The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency. Prior to that, he was co-host of CBS This Morning, the anchor of Face the Nation, and CBS News' chief Washington correspondent. He is also a contributing writer to The Atlantic, co-host of Slate's Political Gabfest podcast, and host of the Whistle Stop podcast. He won the Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency as Slate's chief political correspondent and covered the White House for Time during his 12 years at that magazine. The 2020 presidential campaign will be the 7th he has covered. I'm also so pleased to introduce Barbara Perry, our moderator for this evening's discussion. Barbara Perry is the Gerald L. Balles Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History program. She has authored or edited 14 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, and civil rights and civil liberties. Professor Perry has conducted more than 100 interviews for the George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama presidential oral history projects. And she directs the Edward Kennedy Oral History Project. She serves as a U.S. Supreme Court Fellow and has worked for both Republican and Democratic senators. Please join me in welcoming our special guests tonight.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks so much for that nice introduction. Welcome, everyone, to our wonderful forum this evening with my friend, John Dickerson. It is always a pleasure for me to collaborate with the Kennedy Library. I have to say it's my favorite presidential library dedicated to my favorite president because my mother took me to see him when I was 4 years old, and it was 1 month before he was elected. We went down to downtown Louisville, Kentucky, I think because we're Catholic, and my mother just couldn't wait to see her new political hero. And she would say till she passed on, we got there right in front of the podium. So I had a little taste of what I think John's life was in Washington, and we're going to circle back to talk more about that. But one of the things that I truly love about the Kennedy Library is being able to do research and find things online. I'm sure for people who are teaching at home these days, but also for people like myself and John who do research, it's just an amazing resource, and particularly because of the digitization process that started there so long ago. So thank you to the library for that. In addition to that, it's always wonderful to work with John because we are fellow Cavaliers, Wahoos at the University of Virginia. We're both alums of Mr. Jefferson's University. But one of the blessings that I have of working at the Miller Center is that the Miller Center gathers together journalists at the top of their field like John, top scholars from around the world, and practitioners of the art and science of politics. And what I particularly love is talking to these people, if you will, at the conception of their projects, and then being present almost at the birth of that project. And in John's case, we had gathered together with him. Our director at the Miller Center, Bill Antholis, brought the scholars of the Miller Center together with John for a breakfast. I don't know if you remember that, John, several years ago in Washington. And we were all agog at his new article on this very topic of the impossible job and the hardest job of the presidency. And so we couldn't wait for this book to come out. And at the time, he was still working on it. And so here it is, over my shoulder, I have for you tonight the cover of it. So, John, we're just so grateful that you, again, as a top journalist in your field, are so interested in the topics that we study at UVA's Miller Center. So with that, let me begin, John, by just saying, how did you first come upon this topic of thinking of the president and the presidency as the hardest job in the world and maybe having become an impossible job?
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's great to be with you. It really is very meaningful, not only because of that breakfast that you mentioned, which, by the way, I recorded, and it was a devil of a thing trying to get the transcript of that because the restaurant was very loud and there were multiple voices. It took days to decipher what we had talked about, but it was important enough to do the work. And the Miller Center has always been a terrific resource for me, and I'm very grateful for all of its work. And I'm very grateful, of course, to the Kennedy Library, which has helped me in my research for this book and for the previous book I wrote, Whistle Stop, which I was also lucky enough to talk with Ann Compton about when I wrote that book. But the question of the presidency and its the overwhelmingness of the presidency really, for me, was born in the distance between what I talked about with voters on the campaign trail and their expectations about the presidency ever since I started being a reporter covering campaigns, which really goes back to 1992 in the first Clinton campaign. And the distance between the presidency as they saw it when I talked to them out on the campaign trail and as candidates talked back to them about all the great and wonderful things they were going to do. And then the presidency that I covered in Washington as an economics correspondent, a congressional correspondent, and then a White House correspondent. They're vastly different things, these two offices, the one that's talked about on the campaign and the one that's talked about in reality. And so looking at what the job actually is and how different that is from what we talk about was really the kernel of this process of investigation. And ultimately, I looked at it and just looked at how long the to-do list has grown for presidents and came to the conclusion that it's nearly an impossible job to do.
Well, we certainly want to dig into the reasons for that. But let's start, speaking of conceptualizing and contraception, perhaps. Let's talk about the founding fathers who sort of contravened our first Constitution, our Articles of Confederation, which did not have a presidency as such. It was, of course, a very weak federal government, a national government, because we had just fought a revolution to get away from a strong central government. Instead, they obviously had a Congress under the Articles of Confederation, but the important units of government were the states. We had virtually no national executive and no national judiciary. So James Madison decided by the time they got to Philadelphia, we were going to need not just to tweak the Articles of Confederation, but to come up with a new constitution, including Article 2, which would include the development, the conceiving of the presidency. So what did our founders think this job was going to be?
Well, the short answer is nothing like what it became. But to go back to what they were thinking, one of my favorite discoveries in looking at the conception of the presidency in that hot summer of 1787 was the time I spent with John Hanson, who was actually our first president, the first president of the United States of Congress assembled, which was the sad little presidency we had under the Articles of Confederation. And the funny thing is, even John Hanson complained about how hard the job was, even though the job was almost ceremonial. But what they wanted was, of course, a national government that could handle the nation, not just have individual colonies or individual states, because they found that commerce was basically hamstrung by that arrangement, and national defense was impossible to organize if you were having to go to each state to try to raise money to pay the army. So the conception of the presidency, though, was a strong office that could operate in secrecy and with energy and handle those moments of national defense, but then that would be circumscribed by a very powerful Congress and a powerful judiciary. As FDR described it, it was like three horses pulling a plow. All three would operate together. They were obviously very conscious of two things. One, a president that was too strong, too big, might become like a monarch. But also, you mentioned Madison, very scared about the mob, very worried about a Congress that would be too whipsawed by the whims of the people. And so they wanted to build something there where there was tension. What they would see now in the presidency, with all of these blooming duties that a president has and the sort of hyper celebrity nature of the office, would be something that would terrify them, because their worry about a president was that their ambition would get overwhelmed by the power of the office. And the celebrity nature of the presidency today is very tempting for anybody with ambition to turn into something more than just a good public servant.
Right. Well, before we get into all of the new jobs that presidents have taken on, can we go through, your book is so great as a work of history, in addition to carrying out the thesis that you have. So can we talk a little bit about coming forward from Madison's idea, and Hamilton, by the way, so popular a figure now, in terms of his thinking of this energetic office. I'm not sure that Hamilton thought of it in terms of a rap and Broadway hit office, but certainly thought of it as energetic. He wanted it to be an energetic office. And the founders talked about maybe having a troika. Maybe they should have sort of a committee that would function as a chief executive, getting beyond the Hanson model of the little weak president of the Congress in a way. So what were the real changes, starting even with George Washington? Where do you pinpoint, as we come from Washington to the present, these changes that start to accrue power to the president?
Well, you mentioned the troika. That was Benjamin Franklin's preferred version of the presidency. And one of my favorite moments in the creation of the presidency, in Madison's notes, which thank goodness he took notes, because, of course, the conversation in the summer of 1787 was all in secret. They nailed the windows shut, as you know, so that nobody could overhear what they were talking about. George Washington was such a stickler, he didn't even write about it in his journals. But Madison, thank goodness, took notes. And my favorite moment is they raised the question of the presidency and whether it should be a single person or a committee, the idea being that a committee would help constrain individual ambition. And there's a pause, as Madison writes, a great pause ensued, because nobody wanted to broach the idea that you would maybe need a committee if a single president was not virtuous enough. Why? Because they all knew Washington would be the first president. And to say there needed to be a committee would suggest that Washington lacked the virtue to be able to handle the job himself, which I just love that moment of drama which comes out of Madison's notes. Washington takes the job. As you know, he writes that he's walking on untrodden ground. He's worried, but also he feels the weight of both the job and the expectations of his countrymen. But he also feels like every step he takes will set a precedent for the men who come after him. And that instills two things in the job. One, it's a job in which the person who has it is a model for public virtue and is seen that way, not just in how a president behaves, but in terms of how public men behave. And secondly, that it is a stewardship job, that it is a job that you hand off and that you are also steward of. And we think about that still being a part of the presidency today. But the two big bends in the road for me are, as America transfers from being an agrarian country to being a more industrial country, you need expertise in a federal government that that relies more on what we would call the bureaucracy today. You need a permanent group of people who are experts in the laws and the management of a complicated country. And that happens at about the turn of the century. One of my favorite little moments is Teddy Roosevelt tries to use the scientific method, which comes out of this industrial change America is going through, and make the presidency and make government in general more closely to the scientific method, basically be more efficient, get things done, follow the new modern processes. And so he has a commission, he suggests all these wonderful ways to reorganize the executive branch, and Congress, which has control over how the executive branch is organized, one of those constraints that the founders put in to make sure the executive didn't get too big for his britches. Congress totally ignores him, doesn't even answer him. He sends over this massive study. They completely ignore him. FDR then comes along in 1937 and presents the Reorganization Act, which is essentially his desperate plea after he commissioned his own commission, the Brownlow Commission, to reorganize the executive branch. His argument basically, modernity is moving too fast for us to keep up. We need more staff. We need bigger organizations to deal with the pace of America's growth. Congress it gets furious at the request. There is marching in the streets that he's becoming a dictator, and events just overtake the people's fears about growing the office too big. The Great Depression requires energy from the executive that essentially becomes permanent. We now turn to the presidency as the answer for most of our domestic ills, whereas before 1933, it's mostly handled at the local level or by Congress. And then, of course, the Second World War, the Cold War, and the War on Terror expand the national security state so that on domestic affairs and foreign affairs, the presidency becomes the almost the one-stop shop for America's concerns when it comes to their government.
Well, it does indeed. And I'm so glad that you talked about Teddy Roosevelt. And before we get to that change in the 20th century, I'm thinking even about Andrew Jackson, for example. And another key point that I think we'll come to because you deal with it so masterfully in your book is the expansion of the franchise, the expansion of our democratic polity to include many more people in voting. And so-called Jacksonian democracy of the 1830s, so that we have not just white males who have property, like the founders who could vote. And I always point out that even with that, they thought we should have an electoral college to check the voters, even when it was people like themselves who were only going to be the people who could vote. But by the time we get to the 1830s, then white males who don't own property are allowed to vote. And that obviously is another step forward. And certainly Jackson reached out and grabbed a lot of power. Obviously Lincoln during the Civil War. But my colleague, Russell Riley, I know you know, who works with me in the oral history program at the Miller Center, talks about what he calls American regicide. And he says, after wars, when presidents tend to take on power, the American people tend to try to grab it back. And so you have, after the Civil War, oftentimes a series of rather weak presidents until you get to Teddy Roosevelt. And I'm so glad that you raised him, because he talks about that stewardship theory of the presidency and an active presidency. And he says a president should be as active as he can be, just like Teddy Roosevelt himself, right? That he should be as active as he can be. And only if he's explicitly forbidden from acting by the Constitution or a law should he not act. And that's what put him at odds, right, with William Howard Taft, his protege, because Taft, who would end up being the Chief Justice of the United States, had the opposite view of the presidency, that it should be passive. It should be a passive role, and that he should only do the things the Constitution says he should do. But in effect, he loses that battle, right? Yeah. It's the 20th century, as you say, particularly with FDR, the growth of the bureaucracy, in part because the states couldn't handle the Great Depression. They didn't have enough power, right? It had to go to the central government.
That's exactly right. And in everybody remembers from FDR's inaugural address, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But Jonathan Alter points out that more importantly in that was that he used the word action 8 times. And this gets at what you're talking about, which was this thirst for action. And what's funny about the protests in the streets in 1937 against the Reorganization Act, which was hailing FDR as a dictator, is that in 1933, Walter Lippmann and other people were asking FDR to be a dictator. They were saying, there was an editorial, I think it was in the New York Daily News, that was headlined, "A dictator if necessary." In other words, there's a lot to be done. Go ahead and be a dictator and get, and move quickly to answer the challenges of the day. But you're right. I mean, you think of Coolidge, who, came between Teddy Roosevelt and FDR, basically defining the job as something where it was a success if he didn't have to get involved. So, I mean, he knocked off by lunchtime, whereas FDR was a constant dervish of activity. And so it feels like, to me, you have Teddy Roosevelt, I think, also, we didn't have television, but he was kind of a pre-television president in the sense of himself, in the sense of the theatricality of the office. Of course, later when he campaigns on the Bull Moose ticket and gets shot in Milwaukee and continues to give his speech. I mean, the amazing theatricality of the job. It feels like a sort of a tug of war until FDR, and then as you say, the dam breaks, and that's it. And largely because one of the things that I didn't go into too much because the book was already getting too long, but was the 3-year debate with Truman in Congress over the National Security Council and the powers basically to give the president to handle the Cold War. And essentially, it's a victory for him and for the White House to expand that national security portfolio, which locks in, you talked about Lincoln, you know, after the Civil War, the powers kind of recede from the presidency. Truman locks in the powers. I mean, the Cold War locks them in too, but you can see the powers getting locked in a way after the Second World War that then continues on with what we have today.
That's a really good point, John, to raise about Truman and the National Security Council and bringing that permanently into the White House. And the fact that, it seems to me that we're not going to go back from that, and that the Cold War, we're not going to go back from that. We're not going to go back from the president having power in foreign policy. And in the same time of FDR's presidency, the U.S. Supreme Court, in this case called Curtis Wright, hands down a decision that says the president has plenary power in foreign affairs, right? That he speaks with one voice for the American people in foreign affairs, and that's what the founders wanted. They didn't want a Congress to try to be, now would be 535 people attempting to speak with one voice, and we know that that's really hard for them on any issue. But imagine in foreign affairs trying to get that. Whereas with the Cold War, you just boost that, the World War II, Cold War, and we have a Cold War consensus, so-called. I mean, obviously the Republicans had an internationalist wing and an isolationist wing led by Robert Taft, William Howard Taft's son. But still, most of us, because we were fighting a common enemy, there was less of this polarization that we have today. So that's a really good point to raise, I think, about the Cold War.
It's funny, you were talking about Robert Taft. I was just showing my daughter, this is a total non sequitur, but Everett Dirksen's speech on behalf of Taft at the 52 convention. Everybody, when you're not watching the two of us talk and then watching the rerun of it later to catch all the things you might have missed at first, go on YouTube and watch Everett Dirksen speaking on behalf of Robert Taft. And the argument he's making is for conservatives and not to pick some moderate. And it's just an act of political theater that's a joy if you like that kind of thing.
Well, and who can ever forget Everett Dirksen's voice?
Right. Right.
That deep, froggy voice that he had. But I love that you begin your book with a picture of him and Lyndon Johnson, talking over a bipartisan approach to legislation that is missing from today. Well, we'll circle back to that. What I want to get to, John, at the beginning of your book, you list out much in the way that political scientists began to do from a scholarly standpoint back around the time President Kennedy came into office. You talk in your book about Richard Neustadt, for example, who was really considered the dean of political scientists who studied the presidency. He began his career at Columbia, ended up at Harvard, but he wrote that seminal book in 1960 called Presidential Power. And he said, famously, the power of the president is the power to persuade. You've got it there. I won't. There you go. Oh, I've got that same copy. I won't run to my study to get it, but he was just the god of presidential scholars, and he had worked in the White House. He had this concept of this informal power that would be based in the White House, that the president would be the persuader in chief. And while that sounds pretty obvious, I think, to our modern ears, that was very different from the scholarship in those days, which tended to focus on the formal powers of the president in the Constitution. And we should note that President Kennedy loved that book and read it and gave it to members of his administration and recommended that they read it about the same time that he and Mrs. Kennedy are drawing attention to the White House, as Dolly Madison did, as a great symbol of American democracy in the Cold War. So I think it's so interesting, as I write about Mrs. Kennedy, to think in terms of how they really cared about creating that symbol anew by creating it, updating it, but also going back to its history. But again, to present this showplace for the American arts and for the president to represent the people around the world. But also tell us, John, about, in addition to being persuader in chief, you talk about The other roles that presidents take on that scholars recognize in the 60s, but you really pinpoint even right up to the present, and think in a way that even Neustadt wouldn't have recognized in the early 60s. And that is, in addition to being the persuader in chief, the president has now become the comforter in chief. I call him the nanny of the nanny state. How did that come to presidents to do?
Well, it's funny. Yeah, and one of the people I interviewed for the book is Roger Porter, who teaches Neustadt's course at Harvard. So the legacy continues. What you talk about with Neustadt and these powers, this is where, there's so many constraints on the presidency, and yet, of course, it has this extraordinary power in the office. But those powers of persuasion that are found in the nooks and crannies of the Constitution, that are found in the informal powers, that are created by celebrity, that are created in the moment, are what we sometimes call norms, because after a while they become norms. We start to expect them from the office. But they, in the hands of a truly creative and clever and crafty president, those powers can be quite amazing. I mean, they can change the country. They can give the president political power. They can lift people up. They can unify. They can comfort. And that is one of those powers. Is the pastoral role, or there are two roles that are very closely connected. One is the kind of first responder role, and that's the policy. It's both a policy response and a ceremonial response. And so what that is basically whenever there's a big disaster, the president shows up. And the president shows up sometimes with policy responses and federal help, but then also shows up to comfort. And then sometimes when there's not a physical participation, there's the eulogy aspect of it, which we most famously associate with Ronald Reagan. And his speech after the Challenger disaster. Now, presidents before, of course, had to do this periodically. Of course, the Gettysburg Address would be in this vein, but now it is a constant part of the office. And where I discovered that was when I was actually looking for something else. But I was spending some time thinking about Eisenhower, and I noticed in the newspaper clippings I was going through, there were all of these hurricanes that were barreling off the east coast of the United States. It was a pretty bad year in 1956. And the president is not in any of the coverage. He's not in the coverage before the hurricane hits, getting briefings about how bad it's going to be. And he's not shown, tiptoeing through the rubble in whatever state has been devastated by it. There was no federal expectation for the president or for the federal government to come in and help the people who'd been devastated. There was a congressional process for giving money if a building was destroyed, but basically states had to petition the federal government in a case-by-case basis. And then what happens basically around, and Kennedy behaved the same way. The theory was basically that local officials and local citizens groups would take care of their own when there was a disaster. And for the federal government to step in would, as Eisenhower put it, sap the local sense of community that he thought was a part of the American character. Along comes LBJ, and of course he had a much more vigorous notion of the federal government and what it owed its people, and the fatherly role, as he put it, to the national family, very much taking his cues from FDR's view of government's relationship with the people, and particularly the downtrodden. And I spent some time with Hurricane Betsy, which basically it hits Louisiana. It's devastating, on roughly the order of Hurricane Katrina. And Senator Long from Louisiana calls LBJ and says, you got to come down here. And if you come down here and help people out, you'll be more popular than Eisenhower. So Johnson basically does it for his own popularity and because he needs Long's vote on a number of pieces of legislation. And so he decides to go down and do it. And what he sees is the devastation. He walks into a high school there where all of them, where a bunch of members of the Ninth Ward, which became famous again with Katrina in Louisiana near New Orleans, they're huddled in there eating cold carrots on paper plates in the dark. And he says, I'm your president. I'm here to help you. Well, that essentially is the role of the first responder now. The president wants to inhabit that role. And after bringing and delivering supplies, relief, and otherwise, the president then is usually, in these instances, we see it more now with school shootings, but is called upon to speak to the pain of the moment. Those are totally brand new parts of the presidency that were really not there before, LBJ, basically.
Right. And I think that does create an expectation, doesn't it, on the part of the American people. Once a president steps into that role, it's hard to step out of it. And I used to put on a final exam for my students about federalism. It was right at a time when there had been some terrible flooding out. The Mississippi River was flooding out in the Midwest. And it was a play on people wanting the federal government out of their lives. So it showed a couple with their house inundated by water, and they're holding onto a plank, and they're swimming out into the front yard, and they're swimming over a sign in their front yard that says, "Get the government off our backs." And then the bubble coming out of their mouth is, "Where's the government? We need help." So there is this kind of tension, I think, among the American people. But again, it's hard to imagine that we'd ever go back. And isn't it interesting that these leaps forward in not only bringing power to the federal government, power to the president, but these new roles come with someone like an FDR, the New Deal, Lyndon Johnson, and the Great Society, where they really feel, I think personally, a responsibility to reach out and help the people. And I can just see Johnson leaning over the podium about the Great Society and those big ham hands of his and saying, "Won't you help me lift these people up through the Great Society?" So it's, again, people then get that expectation. It's hard to draw back from it, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, as Andy Card, who was the chief of staff for George Herbert Walker, who worked for George Herbert Walker Bush and was chief of staff for his son, George W. Bush, put it that now the expectation is, unless you are constantly, when he worked for George Herbert Walker Bush, basically when there was a disaster, they said, the head of the FEMA should take care of it, or the governor in the affected state should take care of it. By the time George W. Bush was seen to have failed on the question of Katrina, Andy Card said, he said, "You basically have to be right there talking about it all the time as a president, or else people think you're Marie Antoinette." Now, what's interesting, of course, and one of the challenges in the book was how much to bring Donald Trump on stage, because he is so polarizing. But he is a president who has to be evaluated within the standards of the office. But he is also one of the most standard challenging presidents we've ever had, which is to say that his presidency itself challenges all of these things we've been talking about. And if you look at his response to disasters, he has not played the pastoral role. It's not in his interest. I mean, well, it's not, that's the wrong word. It's not something he is comfortable with doing, and it's not something he's particularly good at. And we saw certainly with with Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria that he had kind of a negative response relative to the expectations of the presidency. And it hasn't, well, we don't know whether it's hurt him or not, because we don't know whether he'll be reelected. And we really only have one way of telling truly what hurts or helps a president, which is whether they're reelected. But he has challenged so many of those traditions. And certainly the area we've been just talking about is one in which he is just basically largely absented himself from those traditional roles.
Let's dig down a little bit on that, John, and then I want to circle back to the president and the people, and beyond the comforter-in-chief or first responder, the relationship with the people. But since you've raised the issue of our incumbent and many of the norms that have been broken, or new norms that have been created, perhaps, what do you think? How would you sum up in these 3.5 now, almost 4 years of President Trump in office, the old norms that have gone by the wayside, and new norms that perhaps he's created, for good or ill, and you're welcome to judge those if you like. And then one of my colleagues, Steve Knott, who's been one of our oral historians and is now at the Naval War College, wrote recently a book on the presidency and about its norms. And when he spoke to us about it, he said he fears and he believes, looking at history, that once presidential norms are broken, they're very hard to reconstruct and bring back to the office. So I'm fascinated by that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know. It's very hard to talk. So the Trump presidency is, we know the norms I just talked about, the relationship between the pastoral role and the first responder role. He has not really played the first responder role, even with respect to COVID-19. He has occasionally done it, but he has largely, in his public statements, undermined the public statements of his health officials. And so they've been the first responders, and he's been kind of sometimes with them, sometimes against them. The primary role in a public health crisis is to have clean, clear information from the most trusted source possible. He had created a condition in which the majority of the country doesn't trust him. And then with respect to information related to COVID-19, he either downplayed it or gave false information, which undermined that key response requirement of a public health crisis. So he has, and that's just one of the ways in which he's challenged these norms. I start the book with a story about Eisenhower attacking Stevenson in their race, and in 1956. And the reason I start with it is because it's front page news that Eisenhower challenges something Stevenson says. It's a month before the election, and it's front page news that Eisenhower is going to slap back essentially at his Democratic challenger. And of course, the president now is attacking members of his party, members of his administration, the opposition constantly. Eisenhower said he didn't want to attack Stevenson because it would be beneath the dignity of the presidency. So that norm is totally gone. I think what governs this is whether another president who would come in and say, insult people as much and as often, including, teenagers, including the widow of a congressman who passed away, John Dingell's widow, Debbie Dingell, make fun of a reporter with a disability. I mean, the list is quite long of the norms that have been broken. Requires a very high pain threshold. Traditionally, people who've come up through politics have a kind of sense of the ambient popular view of things, and they try to stay within the boundaries because their future relies on building support among having people like them, essentially. Donald Trump, one of his great talents is that he has a very, very high pain threshold. He may complain about things, but he is willing to withstand criticism. In the right hands, that can be an incredible talent and skill for a president to have, to basically do the right thing, come what may. And it's often what we say we want from leaders, which is not somebody who just is a weather vane and bends to popular opinion, but actually does the right thing. Whether he employs that pain threshold for the right reasons, people can make their own judgments. But it's a key skill. So anybody who would want to, say, embrace his penchant and delight really in insulting people would have to have that high pain threshold, because otherwise, the minute they start doing it, they'll get a lot of criticism. And if they're worried about their political fortunes, they'll trim their sails because they don't want to be criticized. So, and then again, I think the other thing is when you look at, say, the disaster and pastoral role of the presidency, the reason presidents did those things is because it was an opportunity. It was a chance to gain glory and gain power by doing something to help the people. When you think of the response to COVID-19, when I'm reading Eric Larson's book about Churchill takes over at this desperate moment for Britain, and he's excited about it because it's a challenge. It's a chance for him to run into the teeth of this incredible problem that the country faces. President Trump didn't respond to COVID-19 that way. He saw it as a political problem to manage rather than, every man to their station and let's attack this. So most traditional politicians would have those traditional instincts which would restore the norms just because that's the world in which they've come up.
Well, I think it's so fascinating to think in terms of that, the mourner in chief, the comforter in chief, the first responder. I do think some of that even goes back to Washington being called the father of his country, that many people do see a president as a father figure, maybe someday as a mother figure. But I think that it's fascinating because for example, when President Kennedy died, social scientists fanned out across the country and interviewed how people were feeling. And they were exhibiting the symptoms of having lost a family member. crying uncontrollably, loss of appetite, couldn't sleep. And I was just reading about the passing of FDR. The same thing, that feeling that people have this personal connection with FDR. I think it came from the fireside chats and with President Kennedy, the first television president, really to make use of television. So maybe this gets us to that topic that I said we would focus on, and that is that relationship with the American people, John. And I'm thinking about another changeover that you hinted at with the focus on TR, but also that you talk about in your book with Woodrow Wilson. And you mentioned Jeff Toulis, a political scientist and law professor at the University of Texas, who has a wonderful classic book now called The Rhetorical Presidency. And he believes that what you talked about initially about the constitutional presidency of the founding really pretty much governed and described the constitutional presidency up to the 20th century. But when presidents begin, I think through TR and Woodrow Wilson, to reach out to the people directly, whether that's going to help them in a disaster or they're using modern media or modern travel, but they get that sense that they do need to get out and meet with the people and mix with the people. That causes this change, according to Toulis, into the second version of a constitutional presidency that is very different from what the founders thought. Do you see that as having led to this changing of the president's role, but also is it bad for the presidency as well? Is it something that the founders would have been very scared about, since, as you mentioned, Madison didn't want a monarch, but didn't want mob rule either?
Right, exactly. And you remind me of that, the FDR story when his funeral train is going from Hyde Park to Warm Springs, and a reporter talks to one of the mourners who's there and says, "Why are you here? Did you know Franklin Roosevelt?" And the mourner says, "No, I didn't know President Roosevelt, but he knew me," which is the captures that relationship that FDR had with the country. And that's one of the, and I'll go back to your question about which kind of starts with Wilson, the presidency becoming something that is an office that is required to be in kind of constant conversation with the people. One of the things that I just think in our current moment of COVID-19 is really interesting is that we have the last presidential election was essentially a base election. President Trump was very successful running to his base, energizing his base. Hillary Clinton had trouble energizing her base, and President Trump has run his presidency as a base presidency, speaking mostly to his constituency. The founders would have been terrified about that because they wanted the presidency to be the president of the entire country. President Trump has been very successful for his base, delivering for Republicans in a way it's hard to argue is not among the top performers as a pure Republican president in terms of cutting defense, protecting the unborn, cutting regulations, cutting taxes, filling the courts with conservative judges. The president has done a lot for traditional Republicans. The challenge, though, is that when you speak only to your base, your powers of persuasion, going back to Richard Neustadt, are limited to those quarters. And so when you try to convince the country about something like health measures required to get the economy going because COVID-19 is making people too fearful to engage in economic activity, you need to be able to persuade the whole country. If you have no dialogue set up with the portion of the country that didn't vote for you on any terms, you can't persuade them to behave in a way that might be beneficial for the economy. And the president is certainly running into that problem. But back to your question, Wilson basically argues that Congress has stopped representing the country and that the presidency needs to be a job where the president has this kind of ambient understanding of the national mood. Now, Lincoln used to take his public opinion baths and used to send out aides to go read what was in the papers and always tried to have a sense of where the public was, with his view that, with public opinion or without public opinion, you couldn't do anything, but with public opinion, you could take action. And he needed to know where public opinion was. But Wilson made a more sort of political scientist's argument, which was it was necessary for the president to break the sclerosis of Congress by being the sort of tribune of the people, which required a much closer relationship to the views of the people. Well, that takes off like crazy, and President Kennedy is responsible for this. Basically, as getting elected becomes a process of courting the people. As you very well know, for the large part of the early part of American history, to even run for the presidency was seen as displaying an ambition that was inconsistent with the job itself. So if you were grubbing for votes, it showed that you cared too much about your advancement, and that was deadly in the presidency because they were so fixated on the corrosive nature of ambition. Nevertheless, that starts to go away. I mean, even Jackson, who everybody, we all talk about Jacksonian democracy, and we certainly, when he was inaugurated, all of the dandies and all of the swells in Washington were terrified about all of these grubby Jackson voters who were coming to town to celebrate his inauguration. And so it felt stunning, but even Jackson had to maintain the norm that he wasn't actually campaigning. He had to have people doing his work in the various processes, and there were still layers of intermediation where you had a party that separated the people from the vote for the candidate. But what Kennedy does is basically goes around the intermediation of the party system and basically uses the primaries to convince the party bosses that he has a special knack and connection with the people. And suddenly the primary system becomes the main way to elect party nominees. And so slowly individual states start requiring that their delegates vote as the primary voters voted, instead of just taking a signal from the primary voters and then figuring it out in the back room. Well, what that does is it creates a connection between the theatricality of a candidate and the approval of the people. And so basically you become candidates who, by the way, now have to sell themselves rather than having a party do the selling for them, which is the way it was before that. Candidates become actively engaged in the promotion of their own candidacy through greater and greater acts of theatricality, because the greater theatricality, the more people will like you and the more they will vote for you in the primaries. Primaries start to become captivated or start to be captured by the most ideological members of a party. So what ends up happening is you start having in primaries, candidates have to make these theatrical appeals to the most ideologically firm or most ideologically pure members of a party. And that starts to basically incentivize candidates who play to the basis of their parties. And once those candidates are trained in that process, that's what they then bring to the presidency. And this is part of my very long argument, which is now this answer is going on forever, but is this the way in which the way we run our campaigns has encouraged a kind of political behavior that is then inconsistent with what we really need to do the kind of deals and have the kind of bipartisan cooperation that we would like to see in American government.
No, but that was great, John, because you're pulling together all of these factors that continue to mount up to support your thesis about this presidency becoming the hardest job in the world and almost impossible to do. And that is presidents reaching directly to the people. Then what happens is that, again, media and travel allows them to meet with the people. And then you get into the situation where television comes directly into their living rooms, and then social media comes directly on their phones or on their computers. It's just this, in addition to which we are expanding the franchise even more to basically, at least in theory, everybody 18 years and older can vote, so that you have way more people involved in the voting process, which is a democratic, small d, democratic country, we think is a really good thing. But it also means that, again, we're far, far afield from what the founders ever anticipated. I wanted to ask you about that, John, sort of leading off of your last question, answer to my last question. And that is, when you get to this point of the presidency becoming what scholars call the personal presidency, because it's got this personal relationship, the office and the man, this personal relationship with the people. What is the line that you see between a healthy version of that and demagoguery? And just to remind people that, the very definition of a demagogue, which the founders feared, that's why they put in all these checks and balances on the people, including the Electoral College, was their fear that the people can become the mob. And the way that people get into power in a government is appealing to that mob by appealing to their base instincts. So where do you see that line in our politics of the recent era, and have we crossed it?
Yeah, as you going back to the Constitutional Convention, and listening to Hamilton talk about how the Electoral College was going to work is very amusing because, it was going to be these wise electors who were going to evaluate the virtue of the individual candidates in a dispassionate fashion and pick the best ruler for this job that would float very high above the madness of the people. And the way in which some of the delegates, some wanted, more of a role for the people, but many of them didn't. And George Mason is of Virginia. His line in the conversation over the ratification of the Constitution is that letting the voters decide on candidates is like letting a blind man pick colors. That's if you said that today as a politician, you would be run out of office, because now politicians who don't do what the people want are seen as total failures. And you have a president now who evaluates politicians purely on whether they have big crowds or not, or their ratings. This is the purest example of exactly what the founders did not want. In other words, if you can get people hollering and screaming, then you are a successful president. They wanted the opposite, which was a president who cooled the passions of the moment and used reason to adjudicate these things. So what's the proper mix? You obviously have to have a president who is listening to and in touch with the people, because basically you can't, as Nixon put it, which is right, and I quoted Lincoln saying a version of what also FDR said, which is you can't get ahead of public opinion. So a president needs to have a very subtle feel of where the country is and what it can withstand, or else you'll not be able to nudge the country, or to use Nixon's language, nudge history, which is the presidents can take the public mood and nudge it forward a little bit, but they can't just lift it into a whole new place. And unless you have that fingertip feel for where the country is and that relationship with the country, you can't make progress on the big questions of the day where progress might be possible. So it's absolutely vital that a president have an understanding of the country and where people go. And also, by the way, a feel for people not in your base, a feel for people who will be agitated by the things you may do. And the reason it's so dangerous for presidents to act with executive orders or to take action that is against the will of Congress is that they are basically Congress helps smooth out the losing side, because presumably if Congress is operating correctly, the losing side gets a little bit of something, or the losing side at least feels like they had a fair shot at creating the legislation. But if you do it through executive order, the losing side has no say. And by the way, the executive orders end up not being able to really take care of the problem. But you don't want what we now have, which is a sort of the excessive celebrity of the presidency, and a kind of theater review of presidential performance, which isn't to say there's not an important symbolic role for the presidency. There, of course, is. But where everything is judged as theater, and the most important parts of the job, which often happen out of view, are not talked about. This is why the Miller Center is so wonderful and the oral histories are so vital, because you get to see what the presidency is really about. And sometimes the most important things that happen in a presidency are not things that you can put on film, not because you're not there to film them, but because they're choices presidents make not to act. And yet everything we do in the modern presidency is to create a scene that can be filmed, or that can be sent out on social media, or that can be tweeted. Sometimes restraint is the most powerful and necessary presidential quality.
We don't see much of that, do we, in the modern presidency? To be sure. We've got about 6 minutes before we go to questions from our wonderful and vast audience, so I hope that they are submitting them, and I will begin to read those out at about 7 o'clock. But what I wanted to ask you about, John, is a couple more things before we go to those questions. I would say that your book really can be a manual, a user's manual for the American people and the American voter. And the only reason I'm not showing it with its wonderful cover is that it is here next to President Kennedy. But that I love that the fact that you have questions that we should contemplate when we are getting ready to vote let's say in a primary, but now that those are over, in a general election. Can you go through some of those with us, with our audience tonight? What are some of the questions, if we could be on that debate stage? There's supposed to be 3 debates, presidential debates coming up, and 1 vice presidential debate. You may be on that stage. And our old and dear late friend Jim Lair, of course, was the master of those debate stages. But you've got these great questions that aren't simply, what is your policy or what do you propose to do? But they're much deeper and more profound than that. And yet they're very commonsensical. What are some that we should be thinking of as we get ready to vote?
Well, I'm really glad you raised that, Barbara, because that's what this book is, my hope is that people will kind of follow me along with this journey, which was, I talked to you about this disconnect between the campaigns I covered and the presidencies I'd covered. And so I went back to the original building blocks of the job and said, what is this job and what's the best way to do it? And Al Gore used to say that campaigns are like a job interview. Okay, that's a good place to start. So I went and did lots and lots of interviews with just of exactly the same kind you do for the Miller Center, where I said, okay, you were in office, you were National Security Director, you were National Security Advisor. I mean, you were the head of the CIA. If you were interviewing a person for the job of the presidency, what questions would you ask them? And one of the ones that came up most often was, and this was from CEOs and generals, and was how do you build a team and how do you manage people? So for me, that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, we think of the presidency as a single job. It's not a job, it's an organization. So we should think in questioning candidates and thinking about who we hire, not just about who they are, but how they put together a team and what their theory is for the team. And if you look at the corporate world, that's all they talk about is team building and the power of teams and building talent. They're obsessed with it. And yet in the presidency, we think of it as one person, basically. And we know some of the other players, but they're kind of bolted on to the main presidency. But one of the things I would want to know is what's their theory for how a team works, and to look at their record in terms of hiring and in terms of their relationship with the people that they have around them. Who tells them no, and about what do they tell them no? And why is that an important job? Or you could phrase it another way, which is, what will be the most important job for your chief of staff? Now, or your vice president. And what Biden might say, because Barack Obama sort of tasked him with this, is, I want somebody on my staff whose job it is to always argue the other side. Because the presidency is cocooning, you don't have enough time to study everything. There's a kind of groupthink. You know this so well from Kennedy and the essence of decision, that there becomes a kind of groupthink and you need somebody to be able to pierce that and constantly push against the consensus of the cocoon thinking. So that team building aspect is never anything we talk about in a presidential campaign. The other is prioritization. This I take from President Eisenhower, who was, I was about to say he famously said, I never found out if he actually said this, but it's been attributed to him so much that the urgent should not crowd out the important. And his view was essentially that it's a job of constant urgency. But if you don't take care of the important things, they will become urgent soon enough. So if you don't take care of your pandemic preparedness beforehand, a surprise is going to hit you. And what we see again and again with presidencies is that they come in and they are faced with big surprises out of nowhere that have high stakes. The word terrorism only barely came up in the debates between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and yet it defined the 8 years of the Bush presidency. So that sense of prioritization, how do you know what to take care of immediately, but also what are you thinking about that's a long-term problem that can only be addressed if you start thinking about it now instead of when it becomes a crisis?
I think as well, when we think of President Kennedy, yes, the Bay of Pigs went very badly in the first few months of his presidency, but he reshaped his team. He reshaped the team of military advisors. He brought his brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, into the mix. He hadn't been in the foreign policy team, the so-called executive committee, the ExComm, that was then ready to go for the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I should point out that President Kennedy stood in front of the press by the way. And a few days after the Bay of Pigs fiasco is usually the word that is used to describe it, took full responsibility for the fiasco and said, I'm the responsible officer of this government. I take full responsibility. His famous, words were, victory as 100 fathers and defeat as an orphan. But I think the other question we want to ask is, can you give us an example of a mistake you made? I think you mentioned this in your book. Have you ever made a mistake? What kind of mistakes have you made? And what did you learn from them? Again, a job interview question that would be great for us to hear from our presidential and vice presidential candidates. So I see we're at our 7 o'clock hour. And John, while I'm going to pull up my iPad here and start to look at some of the questions that are coming in, could I just ask you to say a few words about your conclusion? And that is, what can be done to change the presidency so it won't be such a hard job and it won't be so impossible?
Well, yeah, it's and you mentioned Kennedy. My favorite line of his was, he said, I spent so much time trying to get elected. I wish I'd spent more time learning how to be president, which is basically what they should all do. In the conclusion, I run through a lot of ideas and things that are possible areas of reform, with the very humble preface that a lot of these things are very, very difficult to do. But basically, I would think in a presidential year, a few of the things I would point to are, one, to think about the job in all of its complexity, and to think about those things like team building, and to think about the job as one in which you are confronted with high stakes surprises. So which of the two men running for president do people think will be able to both plan for the next set of possible surprises, build a team that's in place that has the tempo and operating capacity to handle the next surprise that's coming, because it's coming. The next surprise is coming. We don't know what it is, but it's coming, because that's what presidents do. They deal with surprises, and they have to deal with them. And you can't shirk the responsibility. And so do they have a team? Do they have a vision to be able to work through some of these long-term challenges? Do they have a sense of prioritization to deal with surprises? So to ask some of those questions that are about capacity, not as much, as you said, about issues, because sure, we need to know their issue positions. But if they are incapable of running a White House in a way that is able to execute on those issue positions, then they're meaningless. And then I think the second thing I would suggest is to maybe just think about the job as it is, rather than the job that we talk about in a campaign. In a campaign, the president can do all of these magical things. The job is much harder than that. And maybe some of the way we should take the pressure off is asking Congress to do more, and ask the president to do less. Stop treating the president as a superhero, and instead put more pressure on Congress to do their job, which takes some of the load off of the president, and gives him gives him at least a partner in governing.
Well, we've got a host of questions here, so let's see how many we can get through in the next 25 minutes or so. One is, how has an election result, for example, a landslide, affected what a president can do? So I think this one is about mandate or lack of mandate.
Well, the question is whether we have mandates anymore, because, George, it's really, so I'm thinking back to, I spend a lot of time in the book going through the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, because in any conversation in Washington, soon enough, somebody will say, well, why can't they just do what Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did, which was get together and come up with a solution for extending the life of Social Security? So I went back and looked at the structural changes in politics that have taken place between now and then. And basically the short answer, and I won't give you the 3 chapters in the book, but the short answer is that the structure of politics create incentives that would make a deal of the kind that Reagan and O'Neill put together impossible in the current context. But O'Neill recognized something after Ronald Reagan won in 1980, which was that Reagan had the country's support, and that he had tapped into something, and that he could not fight Reagan all the way from the instant Reagan got to Washington, both because it was politically impossible, in part because there were a bunch of Democrats from the South who were going to vote for Tip O'Neill to be Speaker, but whose constituents had all voted for Reagan to be president. So O'Neill knew he would lose some of his own Democrats if he fought Reagan like that. But he also respected the kind of larger victory that Reagan had had. But now what happens is, the minute Barack Obama was elected, Mitch McConnell and then the leaders of the House basically said, we have to fight him on everything from the minute it gets started so that he can be a one-term president. And that certainly was the response to Donald Trump's election. And because there were only 16 Democrats who were in the House who were sent to Washington from districts that voted for Donald Trump. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, there were 114 Democrats who were representing districts that had voted for Ronald Reagan. So the death of what we call split ticket voting has changed the political incentives. And so what happens now is presidents come in. Now, Donald Trump didn't have a landslide because he lost the popular vote, but they come in and the opposition is almost immediate. And so honeymoons created by landslides are something we probably won't see for a while. So, yeah, I'll just end it there.
Well, this takes us to a question I think that's so important, and I'm sure we have a lot of young people watching this evening, and we'll watch this in the video format on the Kennedy Library's website. And I know that the library offers so many resources for teachers in addition to scholars and journalists like ourselves. But one of the questions is, how can young people understand the presidency in their young lives, but also if they're turned off to politics? And maybe say a word, this is the time to talk a little bit, John, about your growing up in the Washington area and your mother being a pioneer and covering the White House as a journalist. How did you pick journalism to go into? Maybe because it was in your family's DNA, your mother's side, or because you saw her profession. But how did you not become a politician, for example? But for kids particularly, or young adults who might just be turned off and not energized by someone like President Kennedy, who brought my cousin into the Peace Corps and got me interested in studying politics and teaching civics and political science. What can you offer them tonight?
Well, first I have to fact check myself, which is that there were 144 Democrats who were elected in districts that Reagan won in 1980, not 114.
But that is an amazing statistic.
Yeah, it is amazing when 144 House Democrats had to always have in the back of their mind that all their constituents had voted for Ronald Reagan. So they couldn't just thumb their nose at the president. What I would say is I find the lesson of John Lewis to be incredibly powerful, which is if you believe in something and you care about something and you care about other human beings, you care about fairness, you care about equality, or you care about making sure that business can operate in as unfettered a way as possible without red tape and government intervention, whatever your passion is, that there are moments when people who have developed and built a passion break through. And it's much like a presidency. You have to prepare for those moments. The ones who break through don't just kind of show up on the stage and, hey, it's your moment, go. Their moment is delivered to them in part because they push and because they retain hope in their beliefs and values, even in the face of incredible odds and opposition. And that's why John Lewis is such an amazing character. He believed in the power of love and human kindness and the human story and the ability of that to break through evil and opposition if you just stuck to it. And he had to stick to it at getting his skull fractured and getting beaten and getting spit upon and having countless death threats in a country where his colleagues were hung from trees and lynched. I mean, if he could handle it, anybody can handle it. And when his moment came, he helped change the face of America. There are people who are freer today, millions of them. When the first Black president was inaugurated, he hugged John Lewis and said, I wouldn't be here if not for you. If John Lewis had given up, all of that wouldn't have happened. So that's what animates a life in public service. And even if your moment doesn't come and you don't get a chance to change the course of history the way John Lewis did, you were able to change and affect lives one by one through just your conduct and contact with them. When I was writing this portion of the story and portion of the book, where I sort of imagine what it's like to be the president, to try to get us out of thinking about the presidency only by its current occupant. And I would say that no matter who the president was. I kept thinking about the challenges of the job and the to-do list and all of that. And what struck me in the middle of that was the opportunities of the job. And the opportunities of public service are that you get to change people's lives. You get to inspire people and give meaning and direction to their lives for their entire life. I mean, you get to motivate people and change the course of their lives. And to have that gift is amazing. And that is and just as a way to spend your days, to spend them engaged in activity that gives meaning to other people, and then hopefully increases equality and increases the general share of happiness, is about as worthwhile a pursuit as you can engage in.
Well, this is a related question. It says, with our national reckoning with slavery, race, and inequity, how would you recommend Americans evaluate or engage with presidents who perpetuated institutional racism?
Well, I think that we should engage with it seriously, and recognize that one of the things in the book that I write about is Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania in the middle of the Constitutional Convention gives a righteous denunciation of the Southern states and slavery, and essentially says to all of the, and this is sort of as they're coming up with the solution of the Electoral College, which was to get around the whole slavery problem and the fact that they needed Southern states to ratify this new Constitution, and the Southern states were going to keep slaves. Then Morris basically says you can't write a liberty document, you can't found a government on human liberty and then have slavery essentially written into it. So in the moment, you had a leader in America who recognized exactly what was going on. And the great men who we talked about, Madison and Jefferson, Madison and Washington, slave owners. And so we're not on the same moral plane as Gouverneur Morris. Now, we have to find a way to recognize that, and also recognize that the authors of the documents that Frederick Douglass used to increase the share of liberty for Americans, all Americans, that Douglass was able to do what he did by using the language and ideas that were promulgated by some of these same men. So you can't throw out everything they did, and we have to find a way to rethink what we know about those men and those times and what the foundation of our country is. I recently read Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, which is a very smart and challenging look at the caste system in America and basically the system of the world in which we live, and it helps you rethink some of these questions. And then I think finally there's a quote in the book from Frederick Douglass, which I can't do from memory, and I'm terrified of doing it from memory, because if I do it from memory and I get it wrong, you don't want to. It's so beautiful, but it's
paraphrase. You can paraphrase.
Yeah. He's evaluating Lincoln, and he says, from the genuine abolitionist ground, Lincoln was cold, tardy, dull, and ineffective. But from the ground of the politician in the presidency who had to pay attention to the country that he was leading, which as a president he had to do, he was revolutionary and active on the question of slavery and abolishing it. So what Douglass had done is he said, yes, from this lens, he was insufficient. But from the lens of the job and the time and the person who he was a revolutionary. And so Douglass's ability to see Lincoln in those two different ways, which recognizes the full sweep of history and the complexity of the position he was in, I think is a great model for understanding these individual actors throughout our history, and to understand in our current moment, people who may be tardy and slow in recognizing things, not because they have some internal flaw, but because they just lack the vision or they're just, new ideas to them are harder to take hold of. But
their own experience. Yeah, their own experience that just has not taught them, has not educated them to be thinking where they need to be thinking, as some of us would hope. Takes us beyond the race question, and one that you can imagine for me is especially an important question. It says, since 80 plus other countries have had women presidents and or leaders, prime ministers, why hasn't the United States?
Well, do we have till breakfast? I think that it's for a variety of different reasons. Voters don't see women, or some voters don't see women as potential presidents. I think it's one of the things that has been interesting in the response to the COVID-19, which is a kind of test for all leaders all over the world, is how strong and good the marks are for women leaders in various countries across the world. It's almost, well, it's not uniform, but if you look at the top performers in all of the countries that are doing well, New Zealand, Germany, it's women leaders. And I think that we have this, one of the things I wrestle with in the book is all of the different attributes of the job that we elevate at times and diminish at other times. And there's a kind of macho superhero version of the presidency that we talk about in campaigns that is both not how the job works, first of all, and then secondly, may not be a very smart way to run a railroad. In other words, the kind of blustering chief executive is kind of a myth. And what we find in the corporate world is that more empathetic leaders who understand how to manage teams by doing things other than barking orders or saying, being particularly harsh on them is actually, it's a much smarter way to manage things. And so I guess my point is that the way we talk about the presidency in campaigns is not only different from what is effective in the job, it's different from what's effective in every other big leadership job and the sort of best science right now that we have about what makes a good leader. And a lot of the skills that make good leaders happen to be skills that those who've done the research have found that women leaders happen to have.
Yeah, and so some of those roles that, as you say, we assign to either presidential candidates and or presidents do tend to be rather gendered. There's a wonderful book that I love called With Reverence and Contempt, How Americans See Their Presidents, and that sometimes it is with reverence and sometimes with contempt. But the main argument is that Americans have seen presidents as priestly kings or priests and prophets. And yes, we do have women priests now, thank goodness. But for many years, of course, and for most of human history, we didn't. So some of those roles that we see presidents in as kingly or priestly or as prophets, those have just been gendered throughout our history. So the time is coming. I still have great hope for my gender. Here's an interesting question, John. Who was the most recent president to do the best job in this seemingly now impossible office, and what lessons can we learn from him?
Well, I think there are presidents who have done aspects of the job well. I mean, one of the problems when I write about it in the book is obviously every president is going to fail at some part of the job. It's a very hard job to do, and as FDR said, and Reagan had a version of this too. I mean, we need to think of it more like a baseball hitter, which is to say that if you hit 4 out of 10 times, you're going to the Hall of Fame, but not, but not
Ted Williams, right?
Yeah,
you're Ted Williams.
Not 10 out of 10 times. So, I would, I get nervous about saying who did it well. I mean, you certainly, one of the things, just to pick something I know you've been spending some time with that I was a bit of a discovery, or I just spent a lot of work on it, was looking at George Herbert Walker Bush and the idea of restraint and fighting against those gendered action hero expectations of the campaign, and how in the presidency, restraint and not spiking the football when the Soviet Union collapses and not, and the wall goes down in Berlin, being wise about, and this goes to one of the other discoveries I made when I was working on the book, James Q. Wilson's definition of character, which contains a huge dose of empathy, which when you talk about qualities that tend to be slotted towards men or women, empathy often gets put in the female category, although Teddy Roosevelt said empathy was one of the most important, if not the most important, characteristic in public life, which is, obviously Teddy Roosevelt considered himself the first original macho man. But that ability, in James Q. Wilson's argument about character, he said basically it requires self-control and empathy. And the self-control and empathy part was basically putting yourself in someone else's shoes and understanding where they were coming from. Politically, that's important because you need to understand people who are not just in your political base. But what Herbert Walker Bush knew about Gorbachev and about the hardliners in the Soviet Union was that if he boasted about having defeated communism, he would make his life more difficult in the future. And so he put himself in the shoes of those other world leaders and was restrained in his response and gets a lot of credit for that. And that was not the expectation in the moment. His conservatives and Democrats were all saying that he should boast about the victory of capitalism over communism, that he should declare the ultimate victory against the Soviet Union. And so all of the expectations of the job were pushing him, and he took another course, which in retrospect seems to have been a very wise one. So I'm not going to pick like a president who did the job well, because also one of the problems of the current moment we're in is if you name a president, if I talk about the fact that Barack Obama was faced with the rubble of the Great Recession and that he finally passed the Affordable Care Act after so many presidents had failed in trying to do so, immediately you have people rise up in just hearing anything good said about a Democratic president, or particularly Barack Obama. So now I've said something good about Herbert Walker Bush and Barack Obama, and hopefully that will keep me in a balanced place.
So, yeah, John, you froze up just a little bit there. That may have just been only on my screen. So we will hope that everyone heard your words of wisdom. But what you are doing, which is what we should all do and what the entire country should do, is you were attempting to be bipartisan.
I was attempting.
Indeed, perhaps even nonpartisan.
Right.
So well done. Yeah, John is referring to a documentary that we just worked on called Statecraft, about the superb role of playing the statesman that not only George H.W. Bush, Bush 41 did, but the team that he surrounded himself with did. And particularly in the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, as John said, but also the literal fall of the Berlin Wall, when his own team was saying, go to Berlin. And he was saying, what do you want me to do? Dance on the wall? That would be like poking a stick in the eye of Gorbachev. And he's got problems galore anyway because of Glasnost. So no, I'm not going to do it. But something else in that film really just strikes me. Your point about empathy, John, was that Lori Shinseki, who made that film along with our team, she has a piece where at the end of the first Gulf War, the great victory for the United States, and President Bush 41 is speaking before Congress, and he says, I want to tell you, he says, you may have seen this on TV. And with that, Laurie puts in the television clip, and you see the clip, and then you hear the president's words over it. And he's saying to Congress, you may have seen this on TV where our soldiers took some Iraqi soldiers prisoners, and they came out of their bunker and they were so afraid. And our soldiers said, it's okay. And you can see, he says, you can see this. And so you see it in the film where our soldier is saying to the Iraqis who are being taken prisoner, it's okay. And when he tells that story to the Congress and the American people, President Bush's voice begins to crack. He begins to be verklempt. He becomes filled with emotion. And I think it's in part, first of all, he says, this shows we are a good people. We are a good country. And I think he's also thinking back to 1944 when he was shot down over Chichijima, bailed out of his plane on fire, and lost his two crew members, lands in the Pacific Ocean, in the South Pacific, and doesn't know if he'll be rescued. And the current is taking him into a Japanese-held island. And he knows that if he goes into that island, he will be taken prisoner. He will probably be tortured and probably killed. And so it not only speaks to a president who was an excellent statesperson, a president who was filled with empathy, who had lots of experience. And maybe as we come to these last 5 minutes or so, this is something to ask as well. We had a question, was President Kennedy one of the most experienced of presidents as he came into office? I'll add, even though he was the youngest elected president, only 43, certainly Bush 41 had a golden resume. So can you speak a little bit, John, without obviously taking sides or pointing to a specific president, but if you could put together, you said this is a job interview when we vote, if you could put together when they have a job description, when people are searching for a colleague, what would be the characteristics in addition to things like empathy or experience that you would put in that job description?
It's a great question. And Gautam Mukunda wrote a book called Indispensable, When Leaders Really Matter, that affected a lot of my thinking here, because a lot of leaders are filtered through their system, and we have filtered leaders and unfiltered. And filtered essentially means they've come up. George Herbert Walker Bush was a filtered leader. He picked up he'd been brought through the system of government in the various jobs he had and picked up the skills along the way that were helpful and useful in the ultimate job that he got. It was like being brought up through a company and becoming CEO after starting out as the stock boy. You learn some of it just soaks into your bones. That gives you the instinctive feel for the job that you ultimately get at the top of the ladder. I think so. We've talked about team building, empathy, restraint, prioritization. Those are all important parts of the presidency. I don't want, as soon as you say restraint, and this is a thing I try to get across in the book because it became so important to me. When we talk about any of these attributes, we need to immediately say we're not talking about all or nothing. So restraint is great until there is the moment for action. And the presidency is a job, as you know so well, where you get no easy decisions come to you. I mean, maybe when you pick the art for the Oval Office, that's probably the easiest decision you get to make. And it's probably pretty hard too, actually. But the decisions you make are basically the list of the bad options. And this has been true of the presidency from its beginning. Thomas Jefferson talks about how, it'd be nice if we could effectuate the best thing, but the only thing we can do is choose between two bad things. And basically, often you're choosing between the least bad option. And Susan Rice talks about this at length in the book about Syria. And you need to basically make the call because the instinct is to, with a little more research and a few more questions and maybe a little more this or that or delay, we might be able to make this decision easier. And it won't get any easier. It might get harder. So a sense of timing and decisiveness is also crucial for the job. So you need restraint on the one hand and decisiveness on the other. You need to be alive to public opinion and the country, but not pelted by the constant opinions and social media swarm that is a part of our current life. I do think that this, the notion of character, I spent a fair amount of time on because it's a word we hear all the time. But what does it really mean? And so I spend some time trying to figure that out. And I do think that so many presidential decisions are made alone in a room. And it's your call. And that's it. I mean, this is the true meaning of Truman's "the buck stops here." It's not that a president's responsible for everything. It's that only a president can make certain decisions. And in that moment, you can't suddenly figure out what your value system is. You need a value system that has been tested and that has been proved durable over the course of your life. It goes a little bit back to what I was saying about John Lewis. Unless you have a durable value system, you're not going to be able to get through those moments of pain and trial and tribulation. But a durable value system that can survive and be purchased through the difficulties that it faces puts you in good position for the job. So it comes back to basically, have your values been tested? A word George Herbert Walker Bush used to use a lot. Have you been tested where you've had to make decisions and put your values against the the harsh questions of reality. And that means a life in public service in some way, because that's the value system that gets tested in public service.
I love that, John, because it's, we think of character as high moral character, and obviously we would like all presidents to have that. But I love James David Barber, the presidential scholar, who said it slightly more generally, that character is what life has stamped upon an individual. So that could be whatever experience he or she has in life in a profession. It could be wartime experience, combat experience. It could be FDR going through polio. It could be Reagan and Bill Clinton with alcoholic father or stepfather. So any of those things could matter. Last question, then we're coming to the end of our time with a quick answer. If you could wave a magic wand and abolish one of these roles that has been added to the presidency and is detracting from it or making it impossible, what would it be?
The pardoning of the Thanksgiving turkey. Boom,
I totally agree.
Wow. I think the initiating of legislation, I didn't put this in the book, but Dan Bartlett, who was the communications director for George W. Bush, talked about the irritating dance of, a president has to be involved in legislation or people say he's asleep at the switch. But once a president puts his fingers on legislation, he immediately, in a polarized world, gets the other party against him. I wish there were a way to basically say, you know what, president's only going to weigh in at the end. And you don't know, the problem now is that they basically guess at what the president's going to do, and then Congress doesn't act because they know the president's not going to be with them. But something that would take care of that and that would force Congress to make laws. And then the president can weigh in. But again, you can't know what the president's going to do because I want Congress to take more action and to take votes and put themselves on the record about hard choices that have to be made. And so maybe that getting the president out of the legislative role altogether and leave it and put more pressure on Congress.
Yeah, that's so sort of take away legislator in chief, because it's meant to be in our system of separation of powers and checks and balances. It's meant to be Congress. Well, on that note of hope, we will come to an end tonight. John, thank you so much. And as all of you who know John and follow him on television and follow his work in the news, you can see why we appreciate so much his friendship for the Kennedy Library as well as at UVA's Miller Center. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Everyone stay safe, stay healthful. And we look forward to seeing you at another John F. Kennedy Library Foundation Forum very soon. Thanks again and good evening.